Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, it's time for us to head back to camp. There's an appointment in the deep woods with your name on it. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This is one experience I have been wanting to share for a long time, but always feel overwhelmed whenever I try and share it. This happened in the summer of 2012. I was probably 15 years old, and I had my first job as a counselor in training at a fly fishing camp for kids at Antelope Creek Ranch, which is around the backside of Mount Shasta in California. I had attended the camp for several summers in my youth, and this was the first or maybe second year I had returned as a CIT, since I wasn't old enough to be a counselor yet. There was one other CIT with me who was around my age, as well as several older counselors. So this camp takes place on a private property. There's a locked gate and everything, and it's actually ultra eerie to be rolling up to camp at night by yourself, since you have to get out of your car twice to open and close the gate. We actually heard a cougar one night while we were locking it up, coming in the beginning of the week, though someone was with me at the time. What makes it worse is that there are no lights or anything, so leave your headlights on. Then it's a couple of miles down a gravel road. There's a small lodge rented out on weekends so people can come and stay and go fishing, but that was only occupied when the kids' camp wasn't going on, so it was dark and empty most of the time we were there. A little further past the lodge, you hit our camp. It's a bunch of big, thick, cabin-like tents made out of canvas in a small clearing along with our cookhouse. Surrounding the area is a very dense wood in all directions. All in all, fairly remote location, pretty simple setup, and the darkest night you could ever imagine. Beautiful stars too. Now getting to the juicy part. It was our second night of the week, and we had already had our campfire and had all the kids brush their teeth and get into their cabins. Small note. The bathroom is on the back side of the cookhouse, about a 30-meter walk from the closest cabin. We had a short meeting and most of the other counselors went to the cabin they were assigned to go to bed. Sky, who was the youngest of the counselors, was still sitting on the deck reading a book by lantern light. I walked around back to brush my teeth, and when I returned to the deck to grab some of my things, I noticed Sky wasn't reading anymore. He was sitting right at the edge of his seat, locked eyes on the pitch black forest, and I was about to ask him what was wrong, but he shushed me before the words could leave my mouth. He apologized in a whisper that I could barely hear, and pointed out to something I couldn't see. My initial reaction was assuming he was messing with me, and I started to tell him it wasn't funny. Then he had me move my line of sight so I could match his, and I saw it for the first time. There were these 3 little reflective spots deep in the trees. It was so dark. They were the first thing I noticed. "What is that?" I asked. "I don't know," Sky replied, "but they're moving, look." Squinting through the darkness, barely able to distinguish the trees from the surrounding blackness, I could see that he was right. Only, it wasn't lights. Surrounding them was this massive dark shape, maybe the size of a grizzly bear but up on its hind legs. That's when I saw the lights blink, and then the whole shape moved behind a large group of trees. It very much appeared that the lights were eyes, and the way they blinked and reflected. Only there were 3 of them, in the shape of an equilateral triangle. At this point, Michael, who was the other CIT, comes out of the men's bathroom and looks equally confused and intrigued by us pointing our flashlight at the woods. As if on cue, we hear the most horrifying sound I've ever heard in my life. The only way I can describe it, it's like an amplified snake hiss coming out a coyote. I was so scared I tripped over a board on the deck trying to scramble into the little cookhouse kitchen. We sat there for nearly half hour, panicking, and telling Michael what it was we saw. He thought we might have seen some reflective tape on a sign or a cow who escaped a nearby field, which does happen, but that could not explain the sound. We finally got our act together and went back to look again. We pointed our flashlights out at the spot we saw it before, and there it was still, barely visible outside the range of our lights, moving occasionally just behind a tree, only to peer out at us at any moment. At times it seemed like it was moving closer, but it was hard to be sure. Michael saw it that time. We'd all seen it. We went back into the cookhouse, and by 3:30 we had checked on it, and retreated back into the cookhouse at least 5 or 6 times because we were so unsettled that it was always there and hadn't moved. We even tried yelling at one point, but it seemed like it was waiting or watching. I think it knew we were trying to see it, and it didn't seem to care that much. At some point, we decided we just had to go back to the cabins we were supposed to be in. So, the plan was that we would just run as fast as we could back to the cabins without turning our heads to look into the woods. If we didn't look at it, it wasn't real, right? It worked great. We finally got to our beds. I was in the girls' cabin, and the other 2 were in the boys' one, so I'm laying there unable to sleep, thinking about all the weird stuff we just saw out there. An hour goes by and I can't sleep. All of a sudden I hear footsteps coming up through gravel. It's this thick, crunchy volcanic stuff that makes a lot of noise when you walk on it, and the footsteps come right up to my side of the canvas tent. Literally whatever is out there is standing 4 inches away from me, only separated by a thin layer of fabric. I wait for them to walk away, or come into the tent, or call me out, or do anything, but they never walk away. There's just silence. I waited another hour, maybe more, and there's no way anybody could walk through that gravel without the whole campsite hearing, and I know they walked right up next to me and never left. I felt like I had just fallen asleep when I woke up by some loud gunshots. They sounded close, but not right near our camp. Safe to say I didn't get any sleep till morning. That morning I asked the guys if they'd heard any of the gunshots, and they did. We also went to go check out the spot of the woods where we thought we saw the thing lurking around. There was nothing reflective, no strange hulking items, but behind the large group of trees there is definitely this freshly dug pit in hell. I mean, this hole was like 4 feet wide and at least 10 feet deep before it looked like it turned. We didn't see any evidence of a shovel, and the ground was too covered in pine needles for us to find any good prints, human or animal. We were so creeped out we genuinely didn't know how to react after what we saw. I'd wish we'd taken a picture of that hole, at least, but I didn't have a smartphone or a camera or anything. By the end of the week, the hole had been partially filled in, and not by us. The other counselors totally made fun of us when we told them we thought we saw something strange. They jumped to the conclusion that we thought we saw a Bigfoot, when in reality I truly have no idea what we saw. I returned to the camp year after year and never saw anything or heard anything quite like that. Michael also came back for several years and would refuse to keep his back turned to that particular spot in the woods at night. I talked about it a few years later and everything he described still matched what I saw. I just wish we had an explanation. I work at an outdoor survivalist day camp for ages 6 to 13 located in Oregon, and for the most part it's pretty normal. However, the other day we had just gotten off a fairly isolated trail and one of the kids aged 11 walked up to Kyle. Kyle is my boss and is directly in charge of the camp, and started talking about seeing something weird back off the trail. Kyle asked what it was, and reluctantly he explained he saw a deer head, skin and all, sitting on a stump about 5 feet off the trail. He had been at the back of a group, so he wasn't able to say anything at the time, but he seemed pretty freaked out by the whole thing. Kyle took the kids back up the trail to check out where he'd seen it. When they returned, Kyle told everyone it was nothing, and that it was probably just a weird-looking stump or something. Later, Kyle told me and my co-worker Alex that they had found the stump but nothing had been on it. He believes the kids though, because it's not the type of things they make up, much less sidetrack the entire group for a joke or story, and he seemed genuinely confused and upset about it all. Kyle also told us that while they were near the stump he got a very bad feeling, like he was being watched, and a deep-seated sense of immediate danger. So they got out of there fast. What interests me the most is that Alex had a surprisingly similar story. Apparently a few years back, Alex was hiking with a group of trackers deep in the woods, which are different woods to these ones, and on their way back out of the forest he looks up to see a full raccoon head on a stump right by the trail. He asked the others and they claimed not to have seen it, and they were all laughing at the fact that they had not only all walked by it, but also on the hike out, no one noticed it. Alex said that they thought they were either all too focused on the trail, or that he was lying or hallucinating. He says he shook it off back then, but now he's pretty freaked out because of the similarities, and the fact that he knows he wasn't hallucinating, and they were all observant to their surroundings. Like I said, I trust both the kid and Alex, as neither of them are the type to make things up, and I'm pretty curious to see if anyone has experienced anything like that before. This happened in 2007 when I was 9 years old, and my friend called Hannah was 8. Every summer her parents would take us to a campsite 3 hours from our home in northern Ontario, Canada. This camp was in the Burwash district. Every summer, for a few years running, we would head out to camp for a month at a time. Camp consisted of a few cottages and trailers set up in a large park on the shore of a large lake. Each summer we'd be greeted by our friends that we had made the previous years, and we had ample fun. This year was different. We met a girl named Emily. She was our age but shy. She'd never eat or stay out too late, and we always assumed her parents were just strict. We had sleepovers, took photos together, and she became the third in our Three Musketeer group setting. One day, we actually were swimming. There was a floating dock with a slide on it. We decided to each take our turn to go down to make the biggest splash. My turn came, and for some reason I was carried under the docks, and as I was trying to maneuver out from under it, Emily was holding me under the entire time. She wouldn't let me go, and finally Hannah grabbed me and pulled me up. We both got out of the water and ran to camp. We were reasonably freaked out that our friend would try and do that to me. The next day was the last day we were at camp. Emily came by and acted like nothing happened. She spent the day trying to convince us to walk along the river to a huge building. She said it was a few hours away, but we could spend our last day there, and we had so much fun. We both felt something was off, and decided that it was better not to go. Nothing else happened after that. We just kind of went home, and the following year Emily wasn't there. A few years go by. We were looking at our camp pictures while celebrating my 18th birthday. When we reached the 2007 pictures, we noticed Emily missing from them. Curiously, we asked Hannah's mum, who told us she always assumed Emily was our imaginary friend, that she had never actually seen Emily in the pictures, and you can clearly tell we left spacing for Emily between myself and Hannah in most photos. We decided without speaking to one another to write down characteristics about Emily that would define her. And we wrote exactly the same thing. Very green eyes, brown hair to the shoulder, fair skin, and skinny. What still freaks me out is that I remember being trapped under that dock, with her holding me there. But if she wasn't real, who was holding me under the dock? There was no way that we both imagined the same girl with the same name and the same experience and descriptions of her. We remember her trying to get us to follow a river, and we realized that the river actually led to the Burwash camp prison. When we started reading up on the prison, we realized there were a ton of encounters people had had there. I'm not a believer in the paranormal per se, but this has me trumped. I have no idea why we both saw Emily, why she tried to take my life under the water, or why she wanted to lure us out to a prison. Needless to say, we did visit said prison in the middle of the night, and that in its own is a completely different story. But until today, I can't explain who Emily was, how we both saw the same little girl, and why she wanted to take us to the prison or harm us. Has anyone had any experiences like this? I was about 12 years old at the time, and a member of a unisex scout group, one of about 4 girls in our troop. We went to a jamboree with loads of other scout groups and camped there for a few nights. During the day we did a range of activities, a lot of which were based in a wooded area very close to the area that we happened to be camping in. Every night there was some sort of entertainment for us to go to if we wanted to. On the first night, the other girls and I started talking to a group of older guys who were also camping with their troop for a few days. They were pretty nerdy, and we weren't particularly attracted to them, but they seemed nice, and we had a good laugh with them. Whenever we saw them for the next couple of days, we would say hi and chat when we could. It was nice to talk to some other boys other than the ones in our group. The boys in our troop were older than me, and were pretty protective of us girls. They made sure the other boys knew that they were with us, and we felt pretty safe being at a scout event with older boys watching over us. The night before we left, we had a disco. Everyone got dressed up, and we went along to dance and listen to music. By this point, we had gotten to know the boys pretty well, or as well as we could have in a few days. At the disco, a couple of the boys asked if we wanted to go for a walk. In view of the disco and just hanging out away from the scout leaders as it was our last night, me and another girl went off with them, but we weren't far from the disco and could hear and see everything that was going on. After a while, my friend needed the bathroom, so headed back towards the disco tent. I stayed there as I was hanging out with the boys, which was a big mistake. Looking back, I should have gone with her. How well did I really know these guys? But at 12, I was pretty naive and didn't think anything bad would happen. They suggested we head back but take a slightly longer route so that we could see the stars, but still within full view of the disco. Suddenly, one of the boys held my hand. I felt very uncomfortable but was really shy back then and didn't know what to do. I saw him shine a light on our hands and wink at his mates, who very quickly disappeared. Now it was just him and I. I was even more uncomfortable. He proceeded to tell me he was really into me, even though he was a fair bit older, and wanted to finish the trip on a high. He started to lead me towards the woods and further away from everyone else. I was inwardly panicking, freaking out and not knowing what to say or do. I was in shock and frightened. I tried to pull my hand away, but he held it tighter. He stared forward and kept telling me how beautiful I was, and how he couldn't wait to have some alone time. At 12 years old, this was the last thing I wanted. I really felt that if I went with him, it wouldn't end well, and I was too scared to do anything. I didn't feel I could get away even if I tried. Then he started to sing along to a song from the disco, which was becoming fainter and fainter. I think it was, "Is This the Way to Amarillo?" I was terrified. I couldn't see any way out. In the midst of the panic, I suddenly heard something that filled me with relief. The boys from my troop were calling me and walking towards us. He let go of my hand, and as soon as I felt him let go, I ran to the boys I knew, and they took me back to camp. The next day we were leaving, and I was so relieved. We were waiting to get the minibus home when I heard his voice behind me. He told me he had a great night, and it was a shame we got interrupted. He asked for my number, and this was before cell phones, so he wanted my home number. One of the boys in my group answered for me, told him no, and that it was best he left me alone. I'm 27 now, but still can't listen to that song. If I hear it, my body fills with dread and I feel sick. Thankfully, I never saw him again, and hope to never do so. So the creepy guy, who tried to lead me into the woods. We all know what you were trying to do. You creep. Let's never meet again. When I was growing up, I would spend some of my spring breaks at a cabin in North Van near Capilano. We called the cabin Camp Capilano, and I would go with the local community centre. I believe the cabin we went to was in the 1992 movie To Grandmother's House We Go. It was the house the grandmother lived in. Anyway, I always stayed at this cabin multiple times with this group of other kids and our leaders. We had always all slept together in the side of the cabin that had a boys sign on the door. Never really thought anything about it, but last year I went to camp and we stayed on the girls' side. I had thought the cabin felt sad and strange to begin with, but for some reason sleeping on the side left us feeling empty and gave us anxiety. Eventually it became time for everyone to go to sleep, and I picked to be in the top bunk and was quite content about it until 3 a.m. when I woke up to feel the room ice cold. I had a rather slippery old rubber-coated mattress that my sleeping bag had decided to slide almost all the way off me whilst I'd been asleep. I sat up to get back inside, and as I sat all the way up I saw a completely white little girl that looked nothing like the other kids I was with. She was standing over one of the leaders sleeping on the floor, just staring at her. At this time, I had realized that I was looking at a spirit of some description. I quickly pulled my sleeping bag up and covered my head as I laid back down. I knew what I saw wasn't a dream and it was real. I did the cliché and pinched myself several times to make sure of it. Some time had passed and I was finally warm again, fully clothed inside my sleeping bag, and decided it was time to check the room for the girl. She was gone, and so was the cold, but I didn't sleep well after that. The next day I'd mentioned this to my friends. The leaders quickly caught wind of this and did everything they could to try and tell me it was a dream. I knew this was necessary so the other kids wouldn't be scared, but they were all scared regardless. It was just before lunch and that meant pool time. The creepy old cabin had a heated outdoor pool right beside it, and the groundskeeper and owner were the lifeguard. Being the curious kid I am, I floated over to the side he was sitting at and began asking him about anyone seeing ghosts on the property. He did not hold back to tell me that his daughter had seen a ghost a few times in the cabin and on the trails behind it. I asked him if it was an all-white girl with long straight hair, and he gave me a weird look preceded by, "And how did you know that? That's exactly what my daughter said." I shared my experience with him, and he acted like it was almost good luck that I saw her. I honestly thought it was incredible, but our leaders quickly shut down the conversation after overhearing us. I understand that there were other kids there, but I had to solve the mystery. Maybe it was because I was watching too much Scooby-Doo, but whatever. The same day, the leader sat us down and tried to tell everyone that I just had a dream, and not to listen to me nor the owner of the cabin. I was obviously hurt, especially because they just told me I was dreaming, but I knew what I saw and the feelings it produced within me. I left the camp a few days later with no other paranormal experiences, and it left me with so many questions about the cabin. I searched a bit online recently to try and find something, but all that I could find were pictures of it and a booking website. I decided that I'll email them to see if they can give me any answers. From 1993 to 1998, every summer I attended a Christian youth camp for girls. Camp lasted 4 days, 3 nights. There were about 200 girls at the camp, and it was about an hour and a half to 2 hour drive away from our homes. Some of the camping areas were tents only. Others had A-frames, and at least one of the camping areas had longhouses. The campground is called Ensign Ranch, Kitatis County. You can look up online to see pictures of what these different camping areas look like. It's a really safe campground, and we've had a very fun year. In the evenings we would tell spooky stories, which is your pretty typical stuff for youth camps. On the last night of camp in 1996, when I was 15, there were several of us girls on the top level of our longhouse. It was past bedtime, so we were quietly telling scary stories. I had told a couple, one with the help of a friend called Lily. I don't remember the specific stories from that night, just typical, and the hook was hanging from the car door kind of stuff. After a few hours of spooky stories, someone else was talking, and I was getting really tired and could hardly keep my eyes open. Then some of the girls asked me to tell one more story. So I start telling a story, making it up as I go along, just your typical "on a dark night in woods not far from here" type of beginning. Next thing I know, I wake up, lying flat on my back. As I'm waking, I realize I'm still talking, but once I become aware of my own talking, I couldn't remember what I was saying or trying to say. I was fully awake by then, and I finished by lamely saying something like, "and they all died, the end." I looked around at the girls who were staring wide-eyed. A couple of the girls were crying quietly, mouths open in horror with tears streaming down their faces. My friend Lily whispered in my ear, "That was the creepiest thing I've ever heard." The girls that weren't crying nodded in agreement. They said I was tired and that we should all go to bed. All of the girls moved away to their sleeping bags, and I asked Lily and another girl, Sarah, what I had said. I admitted to them that I'd fallen asleep and couldn't remember anything. Lily and Sarah then exchanged glances, and Lily paused before saying, "That just makes it worse." Sarah nodded in agreement and said she didn't really want to retell it because it was that creepy. Now at this point, if it had just been Lily and one or two of the other girls that were in the group, I would have thought they'd realized I was asleep and were just messing with me. But Sarah was, and still is, a very serious person who doesn't have much of a sense of humor, does not like pranks, even innocent ones, and is honest almost to a fault. So I went to sleep feeling unnerved but exhausted. A few hours later, I was being shaken awake by one of the adult camp leaders, and she told me to gather my things and follow her. I sleepily and awkwardly carried my stuff down the ladder, then followed her outside. Two other camp leaders were standing next to a tent. They told me to put my items inside and then come and talk to them. Inside the tent were two of the younger girls of 12 and 13 that had been listening to the scary stories and who had been crying when I awoke. They wouldn't look at me. They just laid there sobbing. When I went back outside to talk to the leaders, they said Lily had showed up at their tent with the two sobbing girls. The girls were crying and kept saying they wanted their parents to come and get them. Lily explained about the scary stories and about mine being the one that made them cry. The leaders asked me what I had said. I admitted I had fallen asleep and honestly didn't know. The leaders said Lily had refused to tell them what I said, and the two girls just sobbed harder, and the more they tried to talk, the more they cried. They explained to the girls that they weren't going to call and wake their parents up at 3 a.m. and have them drive over an hour and a half because of some spooky stories. Plus, we were all going home the next day anyway. As punishment for me scaring the girls, the leader made me sleep in the tent with them while the leaders went to sleep in the longhouse. The girls cried for a bit and fell asleep. They were both gone from the tent when I awoke in the morning. To this day, I have no idea what the creepy story I told was. No one that was there has ever been willing to share the details. Several years after, Lily told me she would randomly have nightmares because of it. The only details I have ever answered were, my voice sounds the same as usual, and my eyes remained closed for the majority of the story, which creeped them out even more. The story was coherent and made sense, up until the end where I lamely finished speaking. Again, if it had only been Lily and a few other, less serious girls, I would know they were just screwing with me. But Sarah and most of the other girls that were there, including one that cried most of the night, even being a part of a prank on me, just doesn't seem that probable. When I was a kid, I used to go to summer camp every year. It was one of the things I really looked forward to every year since I loved camping. One year I had a particularly weird experience that was one of those situations that was both scary at the time and in some way was kind of funny when looking back upon it years later. When I was 14, I was assigned to a cabin with several other boys, like in any other year. A couple I knew from past years and a few I didn't. One particular boy was a guy called Wade. He was kind of weird, and almost not in a nerdy way. Like the kind of guy who plays sports but also likes D&D and would fire off random trivia. He was there with his fraternal twin brother, and because of some snafu on part of the camp, they had been assigned to different cabins, even though siblings who were so close together in age were normally assigned to the same cabin, barring a specific request otherwise. We had bunk beds in the cabin, and each chose our bed early on. And as fate would have it, I got the bunk on the bottom of Wade. That night when it came for bedtime, we all turned in, and I had some trouble sleeping. Still being a bit wound up from getting to be at camp, about 20 minutes or so after we'd all gotten to bed, the unmistakable sound of a guy touching himself started coming from the bunk above me. Now at that age I did the same thing, so I wasn't one to hold it against anyone from doing it, but Wade was, well, not really going to town, but he was making no effort to keep quiet about it. He went on for several minutes before rather obviously finishing, and after things got quiet again, and I soon fell asleep. The next morning after we were all up and making our beds, I noticed that Wade was the only one not around, so I made a crude joke to the other guys about he'd already been having too much fun the previous night. They all looked at me in confusion, and one asked what I meant. I commented again about how Wade had been pleasuring himself rather loudly after we were all in bed. Everyone looked puzzled and said, "Surely one of you must have heard at least." After a moment, one of the other guys said that at the last minute another camper in Wade's brother's cabin had cancelled, and since a spot was thus available in this cabin, Wade had moved over there the previous afternoon. He'd never even slept in here. Baffled, I looked up at the top bunk just to see the bare mattress, and glancing down to where Wade had dropped off his stuff the previous morning, I noticed it was all gone. I was now as confused as everyone else. If Wade had never been up there, then who'd been in the bed the night before? The other boys laughed and accused me of dreaming the whole thing, but when I later mentioned it to one of the counselors there, he grew quiet for a few moments before saying that there had been a story going around the camp for many years of a teenaged boy who had drowned and whose bed had been the one directly above mine. As the story went, his ghost supposedly haunts the cabin, but the counselors, like many other people, had always dismissed it as nothing more than a story told around the campfire. I know this sounds absurd, but I know what I heard. I was wide awake when it happened. When I was younger, I used to love going to summer camp, but something happened there that shook me to my core, and I told my mum I never wanted to return, and never gave her a proper explanation until years later. I was in a small cabin with 3 other girls. It was a really tight space, with 2 bunk beds just barely fitting within this tiny cabin. But it was fine. It had a toilet for us to use, which was something that we valued, as it meant we didn't have to share with many other people. On the 3rd night, I was closing my eyes and get ready to rest. It had been an exhausting and fun day, with loads of fun campground activities. I remember I got knocked off the rope wire and fell into the water, and even though I didn't appreciate getting wet, we still all had a blast. It was a fun memory, which sadly was dampened by this following event. I lie in bed, waiting for rest to slowly take me, when out of nowhere I hear this blood-curdling scream coming from the bathroom. I think it's one of the other 3 girls. Maybe they slipped, perhaps something happened. So I bolt up, and as I'm in the bottom bunk, I just quickly jump forward and I'm at the bathroom door. I open it and look inside. but there's no one there. Note, the bathroom door was opened a fraction, so I assumed that whoever in there wasn't getting changed or anything before any of you ask. I look around. There's nobody in here. I look behind me, and the 3 other girls are sitting up in their beds staring at me. One of them asks if it was me, and I tell her that I literally just got off my bunk bed. They all stare at each other in confusion and silence, not knowing what to say. I sit around for a few minutes, see if there's a chance that a window was open in the toilet, but there was nothing. We didn't have a clue where the sound could have come from, and the thing is, it sounded like it came from directly inside the toilet. This scream, this unholy scream. We tried to dismiss it. I got back into bed and fell asleep, but slept very badly and woke up in a terrible mood. In my bad mood, I refused to have breakfast, and when a counselor came and asked me about it, I looked at her straight in the eyes and told her in confidence what had happened last night. She looked at me, her eyes wide, and said that she believed me, but it was the first she heard of it. On the last day of camp, just as I was leaving, she pulled me to a side and said that she'd been speaking to some of the people who'd worked there longer, and they said that there was a rumour that the life of a girl had been taken in that cabin right when it was built, many, many years ago. I don't know if it's true or not, but I know what I heard, and I chose to never go back to camp because of it. I don't think I can deal with any more spooky stuff again. I go to a private school, and we do a sort of system where each high school class holds fundraisers and does work, has bake sales, and generally makes money that goes towards funding a senior trip, where we do some volunteer work for a day or two, and then mess around for the rest of the week wherever we stay. It was the week before spring break, so 2 weeks straight with no work. I convinced everyone in my 17-person class that we would go to Pigeon Forge, Tennessee for the week. Everyone was in, so we went. There was enough money left over that we each could have $200 to spend as we chose and within reason. On the 4th day, we all piled into the school van and drove to Gatlinburg to go up and down the main market strip there. There were a lot of gift shops and stores that generally sold the standard fare of cheap replicas and low carbon steel blades that some of us were after. And there was this one shop that was an inside attic apartment called Calico. It was one of said establishments that sold their wares and massive hookers and overpriced vaping gear along with swords and stuff. We all went in to look around, mostly for fun, since we all had loaded up on various other knives at different shops, where the guys actually knew what the carbon content of most of his steel was, so we were basically window shopping and looking for something to put up on the wall. While we were all there joking with each other, one of the more straight-shooting friends suddenly goes all quiet, and I noticed that the guy had come in with several boxes with something labelled like they'd come from customs. The guy didn't look like a delivery man or anything. So he hands over the boxes to a guy behind the counter and in exchange receives a massive bundle of bills like it's a scene straight out of a movie. We book it out of that place and never really found out what were in those boxes, but I'm guessing it was something not quite legal, thus the boxes and huge wads of cash. I was 14 years old when this happened. My school decided that it was a great idea to make us kids of 14 and 15 decide where we wanted to go for our last trip of the year. In the end, after a lot of discussion, we chose a place about 3 hours away from our school to go camping. The place we chose wasn't a run-down place, but it was a nice, huge and cheap place, although in the middle of nowhere. It was an hour away from the next city, in the middle of the woods. We had 2 cabins, one for girls and another for boys to sleep in. A big place to have our hot meals and a few lodging facilities around it for the adults and tourists there. Everything was well lit, where the facilities were, but not around our cabins. Imagine exactly a circle in the middle of the woods. That's the place. The staff were nice too, and it was very good. The thing is, we had to spend about 4 to 5 days in this location, and everything was fine up until our 3rd day. That's when we had to play a game that was suggested by the staff members. The game is as follows. 3 staff hiding in the camping area, and we needed to find them in groups of 3 people and make the sign of piece of paper that each group was given. The first group, to get the 3 signatures, needed to tell one of the staff that wasn't in hiding but just watching the kids, and then they would shoot a small flare to regroup everyone to this huge soccer field we had. But we weren't supposed to enter the cabins or any of the facilities because they were hiding outside to make things easier. The game started. As you imagined, there were about 60 children screaming happily and trying to find the hiding staff. Also remember when I said the place was well lit around the facility lodgings. Yeah, we weren't near there, so it was pitch black, and my poor excuse of a cell phone could only illuminate the ground, so I could only see where I was stepping. It was chaos at first, and as someone who didn't exercise that much, but really wasn't that overweight, just lazy, I couldn't run very fast like my classmates did. It was a girl and a boy. They were crazy and ran way too fast for my liking, and I was constantly exhausted and scared that I would lose them from my sight, which would be a pain since I would have to find them alone in the dark. At first I kept telling them to stop running, because we would get hurt. They listened at first, but every time they thought they'd seen a member of staff hiding, they would sprint in front of me and nearly knock me over trying to get there. I was so done and just focused on keeping up with them as carefully as I could, using my weak light to see the ground and follow the light of the guy's flashlight, who always traveled at speed. Everything was going fine. We found the first of the staff members, and I used the opportunity to catch my breath and sit a bit, and as soon as the 2 crazy kids were with me, we would just sprint as soon as we were done with the first signature. We found the second staff member soon after, but when we found the last staff member, there was a group already there obtaining their signature. So we realized they must have won the game already because their paper had 2 names on it. We got the last signature and ran faster than before to reach the goal before them, me being more and more exhausted. And this is where things get weird. Again, we weren't supposed to enter the cabins or any of the facilities, including the place where we had our meals. This place was huge. The tables and chairs were big, and it was a cozy place with a huge, beautiful stained glass mosaic next to the entrance, and at the end was an open area where we could play games and reach the soccer field, which was where we started the game. Imagine this place was the fastest way to get from point C to A without having to circle all around to point B to get back, like a sort of tunnel. I wanted to cheat the game to win, which wasn't a good thing to do, but we were kids and really weren't thinking with all the adrenaline and exhaustion coursing through our body. We pushed the door open and the lights were off, but the first thing we noticed was the big speaker that staff there used to play music and make announcements. What was weird was that it was playing this white noise, and it weirded us out. It wouldn't be that strange, but it startled us because all the power there was supposed to be switched off when we weren't using it, and the staff explained that very important note to us on the first day. This made us all slow down. We then heard a loud crash noise next to us. I was the last one, with the guy in the flashlight in front of us and the girl in the middle, so the crash came from directly to my right side. As soon as everyone heard it, we just looked back and just glanced at the side because I was so close to it, and saw the stained glass mosaic just destroyed everywhere. The glass all over this small children's chicken statue that had a small rock on the middle or something. The situation was the scariest I'd ever experienced. The guy just zooms out of there running as the girl followed, but I, exhausted and already too tired in a mix of exhaustion and shock, and just fear from what's happened and being left behind, just stood there for a moment. My mind was telling me to run with them, but my body was paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. It was like something was in front of me and not behind, and I just stood there in shock. I'd never experienced it, but I really was paralyzed with fear in the middle of the dark, and it was the most scared I'd ever felt. The next thing that I cannot explain to this day, but a few seconds after I looked behind me, just to try and see who the hell had thrown the rock at us with my weak light. And in my mind, sort of calming me down, not paralyzed anymore, I thought it was just a kid messing with us. But when I look, there's nothing. I even tried to look at the bushes from far away, but there was no movement. I still stood, but heard nothing but the static noise. It was as if someone had tossed it from a great distance, which if they had, meant they had really great aim. And they could have run and hidden before I could even have reacted. And just like that, I looked in front of me and tried to run again and reach my group, because I didn't want to stay there any longer, and I didn't want to stop because I felt I would be paralyzed again. I reached my classmates, not as far as I expected, already seeing them with the other kids in the field ahead. In the end, we arrived as they were already shooting the flare, because there was another group in front of us that had finished the game. I don't really remember much of what happened next, just me and the two kids were silent. Next, I remember that just as apparently another kid passed the place we were a few minutes later, they reported the broken glass and our class were called in. We even told the two staff members there that it wasn't us, but I don't remember if they believed us or not. And when we got there, the power was on again, so the speaker had no way of being on when we were in it. Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you so much for listening. I do hope you liked tonight's summer camp experiences. If you did, well, it would mean a lot to me if you would do the usual stuff, which I'm sure you know what it is. If there's a story of spooky stuff or horrible encounters that have happened to you, feel free to send it to me. Links are where you think they are. Now, I'd like to extend a huge thanks to my patrons and my members. You guys are amazing, and if you would like exclusive perks just for those guys, you can sign up. Entirely optional, relatively inexpensive, and it's obviously good for me, and I really appreciate it. It really helps out. Thank you, everyone. I think it's best to leave it there. I'll see you tomorrow. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.